Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting to order, please. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Budget and Finance Committee meeting for Monday, March 9th, 2020. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee, joined by my colleague, Councilmember Koretz. Due to the National League of Cities and other absences, we will not have a quorum today. We're going to go ahead and proceed with today's agenda in any event. So the first order of business will be to take agenda item comment from our multi-item speakers. So I'd like to ask Mr. Previn to come on up first, followed by Mr. Sachs.
Thank you. It's Eric Previn from Studio City, and I've taken note that you have a number of pedestrian traffic accidents. There's also an automobile accident at the intersection of Burbank and Agnes, and typically when we have a case that's about to be settled, we put the district in which it occurs. Like, for example, item number 3 is in CD4, item number 4 is in CD5, but on item number 2, we've left out the council district. I believe it's in CD2. I don't know why, if that's a typographical error or an intentional omission, but I appreciate if you could get that squared away for the public when you re-agendize this and allow the public to speak at City Hall. And speaking of speaking at City Hall, today they have accepted the surrender of Mitchell Englander, who
it's not on the agenda.
Well, it's a legal case. Well, liability accounts in the FSR.
Speak to the agenda.
FSR is reflecting our liability numbers. The numbers need to be adjusted upward because we're concerned that all of the overlooking of the egregious conduct of Mitchell Englander, both as the chair of the Public Safety Commission, the egregious dealings with Motorola, with Taser, many other companies, AT&T, many of the clients who hold court under the banner of Englander, Knabe and Allen, which is the largest and most powerful. They merged with another lobbyist firm down here at City Hall. So the reason why I suggest that you adjust the liability numbers is you could expect a number of people who have been violated, like myself, over and over again by Mitchell Englander, who sat there like a imperious addict attacking public speakers for their comments that were critical of his egregious behavior. And Mr. Koretz, you sit there quietly and supportive of him, I assume, but you witnessed multiple times the way he would attract the kind of most insidious behavior of any kind of a public official where he was mad with power. And the problem is that his behavior, which is egregious in Las Vegas and Palm Springs, but really here at City Hall, and yet because he got away with it over and over again, nobody did a thing, and it's metastasized so that we see other characters like John Lee and others engaging in the very same conduct, and yourselves. So thank you and good luck.
Mr. Sachs, please.
Yes, indeed, do. Thank you. Arnold Sachs here. So mid-year financial, are you addressing the structural deficit of the city? Just to give you an example, Metro wants to increase its structural deficit by putting all electric buses on, which is okay, but they want to park the natural gas buses in favor of putting on small cars, micro-transit, which is competition for Lyft and Uber.
Sir, Metro's budget is not on the agenda.
I'm just
Speak to the agenda item.
I am saying, as an example, structural deficit, sir. Please clean out your ears and pay attention. Capital and technical investment. So you're going to go business to business. This is all data-centric. It sounds like one of the supervisors is heavily vested in equity in data. And I think he's running the city, and he plans to make it his city. I think that's somewhat, I wonder, is Monsanto a stakeholder in this business-to-business venture? Items 7 and 8 refer to almost $875,000 and 46 cents, that's the price you pay for stupidity, for 2 bridge sites. Are you enrolling anybody in homeless in the LA County Health Plan? You have a county health path, you have city path, and you have metro path. CEQA defines a generation, according to Metro, as 10 years. What's the city and the state's time frame? Mr. at the Equity Committee again. Thanks, Wendy and DreamWorks for, remember, Luke, it's the life, it's the forest. And again, we have stakeholders and we have stockholders. Who are the stakeholders here and who are the stockholders? That would be an interesting question for debate. It's very interesting, and thank you so much for the 2 minutes. Waste of time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sachs. Mr. Kretz, I'd like to propose that as a recommendation of the chair and a member, we, on item number 7, that we concur with the Homelessness and Poverty Committee and approve the motion as amended to authorize a general city purposes fund loan from account number 100/56 rather than a reserve fund loan in the amount of $305,555.56, which will be reimbursed through the state's Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program grant receipts. Any objection?
I would be an enthusiastic supporter of that.
All right, then that will be the action of the chair and one member. And then on item number 8, I would propose that on recommendation of a chair and a member, we concur with the Homelessness and Poverty Committee and approve the motion as amended to authorize a general city purposes fund loan from account number 100/56 rather than a reserve fund loan in the amount of $566,665, which will be reimbursed through the state's Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program grant receipts.
And I will enthusiastically support that as well.
So that will be our recommendation as well. On item number 6, I would recommend that we approve the recommendations contained in the CAO report dated March 3rd, 2020 on item number 6. And if there's no objection, that will be the recommendation of the chair and Mr. Kretz. So that will bring us next to the FSR, item number 5.
Item number 5 is the City Administrative Officer Report relative to the third financial status report for fiscal year 2019-20.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Wilson Poon from the CAO's office, and I will be walking you through the third FSR this afternoon. For the third FSR, we are reporting $164 million in citywide overspending, which is $10 million more than the $154 million we reported in the second FSR. This increase is primarily attributed to the recent court approval of the Levinsky settlement, as well as increased healthcare expenses in HRB. In this report, we have identified various actions to kind of close this budget gap without the use of the reserve fund until the year end. First of all, I'll walk you through our revenues. Based on our review of data through December, revenue is $23 million above planned receipts of $3.1 billion. This is due to higher receipts in property, documentary transfer tax, parking fines, franchise income, and interest earnings, but is offset by shortfalls in former CRA remittances, departmental and grant receipts, and utility users, business, transient occupancy, and parking occupancy taxes. Although we are above plan at this time, it does not necessarily mean we may finish above plan, so we're not recommending any revisions to our 1920 revenues at this time. Any revisions to our 1920 revenues will be included as part of the development of the 2021 budget. For our expenditures, if I can get you to draw your attention to Table 1 of page 5. As I mentioned, we have identified $164 million in over expenditures, which is $10 million more from the $154 million we identified in the last FSR. These over expenditures are still mainly attributed to increased salary obligations pursuant to various new labor agreements and unbudgeted costs related to the wildfire incidences. We are still unable to determine the full impact of the special salary adjustments, and the controller is reporting that these adjustments will be implemented in the payroll system after the mid-year reporting period. However, the conversion from a 15-step salary structure to a 12-step salary structure and some of the smaller special salary adjustments were implemented into the city's payroll system. And so those costs are now being reflected in the department's year-end projected expenditure amounts. Therefore, we reduced the $43 million we are carrying from the impact of these labor agreements by $10 million to $33 million. As mentioned earlier, we also have new over expenditures of $10 million for attorney fees and administrative costs related to the Levinsky settlement. In addition, we received updated enrollment numbers from the Personnel Department, and therefore we adjusted our HRB civilian health care expenses from $13 million to $21 million. We also received an update this morning from the city clerk with updated March election costs from the county. We were tracking a cost of about $15 million in this table. That cost has now been reduced to $10 million. So we have about $5 million that we can take off our citywide spending amount. Also, in attachment 6 of our report, we are recommending various transfers, about $39.7 million from the UB reserve for mid-year adjustments to various departments and funds to address a portion of this overspending. These transfers are critical to provide these departments and funds sufficient funding to get them through the year-end FSR. After this transfer, this will basically zero out the UB reserve for mid-year adjustments account. Next, we have our budget balancing section. For our second round of budget reductions, we were able to identify $2.3 million in additional savings, as illustrated on Table 2 of page 7. Of this amount, we're recommending that $200,000. I'm sorry. Yeah. Of this amount, we're recommending that $200,000 be retained within the animal services and emergency management departments to offset the current year overspending in those departments. We are recommending that the remaining $2.1 million be transferred to the UB reserve for mid-year adjustments to offset citywide overspending. We worked diligently with these departments to develop these reductions to ensure that there's no impact to service levels. With the uncertainty of the MOU special adjustments and the pending retro payments, departments were reluctant to identify additional savings until those payments were made. So we are hoping to come back in the year in FSR with additional reductions since we have a significant budget gap to close. Also, as illustrated on Table 3 on page 8, the recommended transfers from the UB reserve for mid-year adjustments account will basically reduce our citywide overspending from $164 million to $124 million. $38 million in potential future actions, which include the transfer savings from the TRAN and the CAP finance, would further reduce the citywide overspending amount to $86 million. Now to go on to our reserve section. City's reserves total about $520 million, or 7.92% of the 1920 general fund adopted budget. With the $39.7 million that we're transferring out of the UB reserve, there's a zero balance left in this account. The reserve fund balance was reduced by about $5 million from $409 million in the second FSR to $405 million in this report. This reduction was due to reserve fund loans for bridge home projects. This balance represents 6.16% of the general fund budget, which remains above the 5% reserve fund policy. We have about $76 million that can be transferred from the reserve before it drops below the 5% policy minimum. There are no significant changes to the budget stabilization fund, and the balance remains at $115 million. However, I did want to note that pursuant to the recently adopted revised financial policies, this office is also presenting, in recommendation number 7, the average annual ongoing growth threshold for the 2021 budget of 4.3%. This represents the 20-year average of the actual annual growth of cumulative receipts from the 7 major general fund taxes. So our office recommends refraining from using the reserve fund at this time to offset current year overspending. We still have a significant budget gap to close, and to the extent possible, departments should continue to manage within their existing budgets. To quickly summarize, we have $164 million in citywide overspending, and reports, recommendations in this report will reduce that to $124 million, and potential future actions will further reduce us to $86 million. Even with the transfer of $76 million from the reserve, we still have about a $10 million budget gap. We'll continue to look for solutions and come back to report in the year in FSR. Lastly, we have an amendment to the mid-year FSR to allow the planning department to process the Valley Village specific planned refunds. which I can read into the record. I've also provided copies to the clerk. Number one, reduced budget fiscal year 2019-20 appropriations to the Department of City Planning, Fund Number 100, Department 68, Account 001010, Salaries General by $500,000 from the City Planning Case Processing Special Revenue Fund, Number 52D, Department 68, in order to process potential refunds of up to $500,000 for limited applications. And number two, reduce the budget fiscal year 2019-20 appropriation within Fund Number 52D, Department 68, Account Number 68168S, City Planning by the corresponding amount of $500,000. I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you very much. So with all of the recommendations that the CAO is proposing in this report, the city's remaining reserve still is at 7.92%. That's after consideration of all of the CAO's recommendations.
That's correct.
Okay. So, but that doesn't include the possible future $38 million in savings that would come from MICLA and TRAN savings if we were to appropriate those savings into the budget.
That's correct.
Okay. So with that, we can still stay above the 5% financial policy requirement for the reserve with $76 million in additional solutions, plus $38 million that would be potential savings if those were to be realized in the TRAN and the MECLA.
Correct.
Okay. Great. So a couple of questions, just a couple for the CAO. One is relating to the SDRF. And there's a significant reduction in the projected revenues, $19 million from what was budgeted in the SDRF. Is that, can I ask you about that, or should I bring up Street Services or Public Works or somebody for that?
Probably Street Services.
Okay, so we'll say that and do that in the departmental. It's okay, because we're going to bring up the departments separately. We'll do that separately. So then the other one that I had was on the GCP. There's a reduction in appropriations of $2.95 million for census operations and outreach. And the reason that attributed for that is that there's going to be grant funding from the county. And I just wanted to be clear, because it wasn't quite clear in the FSR, that in fact we'll be receiving that much in grant funding from the county.
That's correct.
Okay.
Brian, Office of the CEO. That's
Okay.
correct, Councilmember.
So this recommendation will not result in any loss in census outreach or operations. It's a wash with the grant funding.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. Mr. Kretz, anything for the CAO before we get to departments?
I'd just ask Animal Services to answer a question. I don't have any other departments to question.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Hang tight just in case. So we're going to do our departmental roll call now, and this will be a shorter than usual roll call since there's only two of us. Mr. Kretz would like to hear from Animal Services. I'd like to hear from Street Services on the aforementioned issue, the City Attorney's Office, the City Clerk, and whoever can answer questions on the HRB about workers' compensation expenses. Okay. So if there's anybody who is here on issues unrelated to those departments, thank you for coming down. We appreciate your visiting with us again. Have a great day. And while they're working their way quietly as possible out of the room, let's go ahead and invite up Animal Services first. And folks, if you could please exit the room as quietly as you can so we can continue with our work. Animal Services, please. Mr. Kretz.
I just wanted to ask, since Animal Services is kind of habitually underfunded in terms of being able to fully do their job, what adjustments will the department have to make to absorb the amount allocated, supposedly without reducing services?
In the report, we were identified that we were going to have a shortfall of approximately $145,000, but in the FSR that we will be submitting to the CAO tomorrow, we've already identified a surplus of approximately $800,000. So even if we do request some of that funding be used for the overtime, we'll still end the year with approximately $400,000 surplus.
Okay, so you're in better financial shape than I was expecting.
Yes, and we've already taken into account the retro checks the payments for the retro checks that will be made at the end of this year, and the overtime deficit that we projected for this year has to do with the Getty fires, the Saddle Ridge fire. We're a 24/7 operation, so our staff has to work holidays and 7 days a week. So those are some of the issues that our department deals with on an annual basis.
And despite that, you're in better shape and able to absorb this amount.
Yes, most
Okay.
definitely.
Yeah, I thought the opposite would be true because of all that extra expense from the fires. So I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
No, we're in good shape.
Great. That's all I got.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead and bring up street services next, please. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Rose Karagizian, Street Services.
Nicole Trujillo, with the Office of the CAO.
Okay, so we're dramatically reducing the assumed revenues from the SDRF, and I want to try to get some of the backstory on why that is. And I get that this is a policy in flux, but this is a dramatic change. So I'd just like to hear the backstory on that, please.
The projection for 1920 was, as reflected in the report, is $54.4 million, which is a decrease of $19 million from the adopted budget, and we expect that it may be two things. It could be better coordination between utilities and the Bureau of Street Services, resulting in less street cuts, or it could just be the utilities doing less cuts due to the increase of the cost for per.
Let me go ahead and address this specific question. Adel Haj Khalil, General Manager for Streets LA. As you know, this policy is new, and a lot of telecommunication companies have had issues with the increase in the fees. And we've had a lot of discussions and meetings with these telecommunication companies because they're concerned that this has a huge impact on their operation cost. I believe some of them are holding back, trying to figure out how this is going to be resolved, and they're not moving forward on their permits. So that's I think a lot of them are trying to figure out what's next. As you know, we've adjusted through a policy action by the council is the micro-trenching, allowing micro-trenching to be occurred. So the utility does not have to completely make a huge trench. They can do a smaller trench. That's brand new. I don't think it has the impacts. But my understanding from meeting with folks like Verizon and others that they were holding back. They were projecting a lot more construction, and they want to hold back until they figure something out. So that's probably why you see in that reduction. On the positive things is one of the things that we are doing is putting out the information on the streets that we're paving. And as you know, if the street is scheduled to be paved and you go in within a year before we pave, you're excluded from paying. So I think they're trying to figure that out, and which is, we're trying to coordinate better. So we're putting the information on the website, and we're trying to put at least the next 2 to 3 years. We have 2 years on the system showing where we're going to be paving, and they're working out, I think. But the majority, I think, is utilities, and especially telecommunication companies, holding back, trying to see what's the final action as part of their communication with council and the mayor's office and us on how to make it better to work. As you know, today I'm meeting with AT&T this afternoon about the same thing with the Bureau of Engineering, trying to understand the options. And we will keep you posted. And
Okay. So the good news there is, while it's a reduction in revenue, the reason for the reduction in revenue is less street damage.
Exactly.
Being caused by utilities, so
better
there's
coordination, yes.
offsetting benefit on the expenditure side to coincide with the revenue side.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay. Let me just make sure I didn't have anything else for street services. Mr. Kretz, anything?
I do not have anything else for them.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's it for me. That will bring up City Attorney next.
Samantha Ju, Office of the CAO.
Is there anybody from the City Attorney's office here?
I can answer any questions you may have.
Deputy City Attorney Dan Whitley, I've called back to our office. Someone should be on their way shortly.
Okay. Well, let's. Why don't we go next to the clerk then instead?
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Holly Walcott, City Clerk. What can I answer for you?
Well, let me just say first and foremost that I think Los Angeles County is united in its sentiment that we wish that the city clerk's office had conducted the city council elections instead of the county this year.
Thank you, sir.
But that being said, the colossal mess-ups that happened in this election aside, I'm surprised by the sort of colossal variance in price compared to what we had budgeted. We had budgeted $8.7 million for the cost of the election, and it's coming in at nearly double that, or we're estimating that it will from the county. Why?
We had originally estimated $15 million. It was budgeted at 8.7, but the city clerk had estimated a $15 million cost. It was revised when we recognized that on the county's has an online calculator. We had checked a box that said citywide in anticipation of measures, and when there were no measures, we took the measures off, but we forgot to uncheck the box, which brought the cost back down. Now, that being said, I don't have a lot of faith in the county's calculators, which is why I am reducing our original estimate from 15 down to 10. But with the 8.7 that's in the UB and the 1.1 that's there for the CD12, which we were able to absorb, we may have enough money in the UB to see us through the year.
Okay. Okay, good. I'm surprised that this wouldn't be something that would be more straightforward in providing an estimate from the county to the city to. You know how many races there are?
I think it's because of it being a brand new system. They did have a $300 million outlay on equipment. We don't know how much or when that's going to be passed on to the different cities. There's not a lot of advance notice on some of because everything's prorated by the number of races, so you never know how many measures the state's going to come up with or how many races are going to end up on.
Yeah.
And then there was also a scramble to add additional staff. So they added, and they were pulling largely from their own workforce. And when you're running many of these sites for 10 days, they also added some that were 24-hour sites. So I think it'll be closer to the end of May before we have an idea of how much it actually cost.
Okay.
So again, I'm not confident in the calculator at this point.
Okay, Mr. Kretz?
We have no way to actually run the next
No,
city
we do
race
not.
separately. Do we have a way to ascertain that they actually provide the service that we're paying for, which would be a voting experience that were rational and not voters suppressing 3 and 4 hour waits?
Can we get our money back?
Yeah, we are committed. We have done everything we can to help them out through the last several months. We were on the ground doing everything we could to do outreach and let people know. I think the naivety is that the thought was that people would utilize the 10 days, and clearly they did not. I think we felt like people would wait until the last minute, but I don't think that fact was, I think if there was one key factor, it would be the recognition that people are still going to wait until the last minute to vote, especially on a presidential primary.
Yeah.
This was a uniquely badly situated circumstance where everyone was waiting to the last minute to see who was viable.
Right.
So I'm not sure if this will always, this is the most atypical election possible.
It is hard to know, but I think what we can do to work with the county for November is to work with them on the selection of the city sites that were chosen. They did not involve us until December.
Plus, they're also, I don't know how they could have handled this as badly, but there's got to be a way to change having sites with 30 or 40 voting machines that are largely not utilized, and the entry point machinery only allowing a couple people through at a time.
I think the issue largely electronically was the poll books and making sure that the capacity is there. So that has to be addressed before November, and then certainly to make sure that there are enough operational ballot marking devices and sites for because it was cut, basically it was cut by 75%. So mathematically, if you didn't see this train coming, it was certainly a naive assumption.
No, and also, the one thing that was quirky was that you might have a 3-hour wait at one site, and then another site not very far away would be a 10-minute wait.
Well,
so I think we have to figure out a way to communicate that.
We can help coordinate that too, although by that time, because we were on the ground providing that kind of information to the county, that's what my staff was doing at that hour. However, by that time, largely most of the sites there were waits by 5 or 6 o'clock that night, where there weren't earlier in the day.
Right. Well, hopefully we can, in a not very costly way, assist to make sure this doesn't happen.
Well, any costs we did help them with. For example, we were out there in advance helping them do the setup because they were short-staffed for setting up the voting centers. So any assistance that they requested from us, we did what we could to rally, and those costs will be used to offset our bill.
Very good.
So I think I just heard in part of your answer that some of the cost driver for the county was having the extended early voting period, where some of these polling places were kept open, the machinery was there, they were staffed, and no one was going to vote. What is where does the requirement for that degree of early voting come from? Is that a choice that the county made, or is it mandated in some way?
I'm going to have to look into I don't know if Jenny knows if that's actually in the Act.
Voters' Choice Act.
It was in the Voters' Choice Act. So it would require a legislative change.
State law requirement to keep.
Right, and if it were me advocating personally, I would go for the 4 days.
Absolutely. So I guess that's where I was going. I wonder what degree of latitude there is, just as a cost-saving measure, to minimize the extended early voting, which
However,
produced zero results.
The counter to that would be that the Secretary of State is pressing that the county had, until 2024, has an exemption not to send vote-by-mail ballots out to every voter, whereas in other vote center counties, they were required to send vote-by-mail ballots, and the Secretary of State is urging for November, and that it becomes a very costly endeavor, although one that may be worth it.
And is that, the postage cost?
It's a postage of
the
sending
return
out and the
postage-
return postage.
The return postage cost and all of that, is a proportionate share of that going to be passed on to the cities who are on the
Yeah,
ballot?
it would be by number of voters, and we have approximately 2.1 million voters. Of the 5.5 in the county, about 2.1 are in the city.
Seems to me that, especially since that was really, if that's going to happen, it's because of a Secretary of State request that is the result of mistakes being made by the county that we should not bear the cost of. That should be borne entirely by the county, in my view. But I don't know if there's a way that we can make that case, but I think we should. Especially if the only reason for that additional cost is because of the experience of the screwed up process, that the county conducted. So.
Well, again, legislatively, the only county in California that was exempted from this requirement was Los Angeles, and I think it was largely due to cost.
Mr. Kritz.
Yeah, I wonder if we can get information before we push to, or before the county requests the ability to go full absentee mail-in ballot. You said other counties did that in this primary?
Yes.
We should look and see what the result was, because I suspect that there are a lot of people that vote by mail because they vote early, and that's their habit, and there are a lot of people that vote on election day because that's their habit. And I suspect the number of people that want to vote early but don't want to vote by mail is not that many, so...
That's not the point of sending everybody a ballot. The point of sending everybody a ballot would be so that you had one in your hand, so that you would have the option of, once you arrived at a voting center, whether you had previously completed your ballot or not, you would have one in your hand and could just drop it off and therefore not have to wait.
So
but no
saving
other,
that amount of time by having the ballot already.
Yes. No other county that was trying this out for the first time had a new voting system. For example, Santa Barbara County used the same voting system that they've been using. They just went to fewer voting sites and all countywide. So it was almost a perfect storm.
Okay, thank you. All right, that'll bring up City Attorney. We're good to go? You know what? Let's just go with it, and whoever we have.
Councilman, Deputy City Attorney Dan Whitley. I've tried to contact our staff that handle
It's all right.
budget. Okay.
Don't worry. No, just have a seat, maybe, because it's just one, maybe two questions I have. One is there's a transfer of $1.7 million from the UB to address over expenditures for expert witnesses, medical experts, and court reporting services, and so on. What's the explanation for that? Because we usually have a pretty good. I get that with major litigation in particular, it can fluctuate, but we usually have a pretty good sense of those costs, how they average out over the course of years. So was there something unique going on?
I can speak to that. For this particular year, I did ask the city attorney's office why we were seeing 1.7 transfer, and they reported that they typically don't know how much they're going to spend. It's largely driven by their active caseload. They're watching their costs, but in this particular case, they've seen just more activity, more need to go out to get expert advice, any medical expertise. So That's why we're requiring a transfer at this time.
So, okay, that's not a satisfying answer because, like every other department, city attorney has to operate within a budget, and the budget projections should be based on historical experiences. There are going to be sometimes fluctuations in, for example, outside counsel expenses when we have extraordinary litigation, but most of our litigation is not extraordinary. Most of it is routine. And so I think we need to do a little bit better job of being able to predict that. That shouldn't be so variant. In the scheme of the city attorney's overall large budget, that's not that much, but that answer is not that doesn't tell me anything. So it is what it is. The expenses have already been incurred, but I think I just want to make the point that choices sometimes have to be made in order to operate within a budget. So, and that's what we kind of expect will be done. So, okay. Now, I have a question on workers' comp costs too for HRB, on the HRB side. Some of that is city attorney, but probably not most. So, why don't you hang tight just in case, but let's go ahead and bring up, you have a seat, just don't leave, just in case there's a city attorney question. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Dave Noltmeyer from the Personnel Department.
Robert Roth, CAO.
So let me get to the right page here for a second, but just to tee it up, there was a significant unbudgeted expenditure for, I guess, unanticipated increases in workers' comp costs of $14 million. Now, again, there can be dramatic spikes if there's a few big cases or something, but for the most part, our workers' comp costs should be able to be averaged over time, and we should have a pretty good ability to budget that with some degree of precision. And with the risk management steps that we've been taking over the years, and with better management of these cases, I'm hoping that's a number that's going to be trending downward, not upward. So how is it that we're $14 million over budget on workers' comp costs?
Council member, you are correct that normally, historically, our expenditures are pretty static. We use an actuary that has been extremely accurate in the past. This particular deficit this year is being driven by two items. One is a backlog of medical liens that are the result of an employee who treats under their health care plan and then later files a workers' compensation claim, and that treatment then is a lien against the workers' comp claim from the benefits plan. And unfortunately, there was a large number of these liens that were not being addressed timely, that we have resulted in basically catching up on the backlog. And what we are working on right now with our actuary is to try to, without a proper term, more normalize these number of liens going forward.
Why was there a backlog? Was this these weren't being followed up by the providers or by us?
A combination of both. I mean, there was a backlog of the providers coming forward with these liens. Some of the liens that were actually submitted were not being addressed timely. But we have caught up on this backlog. Between July and January, we've resolved over $15 million of these liens. There was actually a claim of over $21 million. So during the resolution, we were able to reduce that amount.
Okay, so if whatever number that is, that of the 14 million, that is the majority of that is due to these backlogged reimbursement claims?
Correct. The,
Okay.
the other driver is related to our state assessment. This is a fee that we pay annually for the privilege of being self-insured. We were budgeted $11 million for our state assessment, but it is now projected to come in at $13.3 million. So it is $2.3 million over what was budgeted.
Okay, and that's based on some algorithm that's driven by statewide workers' comp costs, I assume?
Correct.
Okay. So if the providers whom we're paying for, that are on our, all of our employees have health care provided at our sole expense. So if the providers are getting reimbursed by workers' comp, by our workers' comp obligation, the providers are receiving a benefit of $12 million or so, $12 million, something like that. Does any of that reimbursement amount result in a reduction in our claims history with the providers that brings our payment obligation to them down?
In theory, absolutely.
In theory, but what about in actuality? In our negotiating with our providers, do we ensure that it does?
Well, I believe that it is factored into the utilization of the health plans.
Okay.
And so, yes, it should be reflected in the premiums that the city pays.
Okay. Who would be the best person to verify that? Somebody in the CAO's office, I assume, to verify that in fact that is happening? Would that?
Well,
you're right that it probably is. It should be. Right. It's just one of those things that, can get overlooked if nobody is actually checking. So.
Correct, right. And the majority of these are for the Los Angeles Police Relief Association and the Los Angeles Fire Relief Association, which I believe they do their own negotiations for their premiums. So I really can't answer your question about who could verify that this is being accounted for. But in theory, it should reduce utilization under the health care plan, which should reduce your premium.
Councilmember, Robert Roth, CIO's office. Our office will look into it along with personnel and their benefits.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That explains that. All right. Anything else, Mr. Kretz?
No.
Okay. Okay. If there's nothing else, then anything else that you already read in the amendment? So, Mr. Kretz, if there's no objection, I'd ask that on my recommendation and that of Mr. Kretz that we adopt the CAO report as amended.
No objections.
Okay. Thank you very much. That will bring us then to our closed session items. So we'll go ahead and begin with item number 1, unless anybody has All right, we are back now in open session, and we're ready to proceed with general public comment. Is Mr. Sachs still here? He is not. Okay, so I'd like to call up Eric Previn, please, followed by Amanda Carrillo, followed by Claudia Moreno, followed by Faustino Martinez.
Thank you. It's Eric Previn from Studio City, and I just want to direct the remaining two. There have not been more than two members of this meeting, so that's not a quorum, but I would just like to direct you to the indictment and the document that's now been circulated around explaining how Mitchell Englander was taking payments from businessman A in Las Vegas in the bathroom, Mr. Koretz, if you can believe it, a $10,000 payment. He then instructed businessman A not to say anything to the federal officials. This is just beyond belief because, as you know, it's watchdogs and journalists and members of the public who come to these very meetings, speak out about this kind of malfeasance as Englander was riding like a lunatic on a stallion into a china shop, and you would all sit there looking down as he would maraud various critics. And now to find out that in fact he was doing not just what we imagined here in the public space, but in privacy, with Fauble's direction evidently, taking fees from crooked developers who then got caught, developers and businessmen. It's appalling. It's beyond belief. So we look forward to a full investigation.
You know, we don't have back and forth on general public comment, but I would just recommend that speakers be careful about accusing people of committing crimes who there's never, like our city attorney, where there has not even been a single assertion of that. So you're dismissed. Our next speaker, you're dismissed. Our next speaker is Amanda Carrillo, followed by Claudia Moreno.
Buenas tardes, miembros de este comité.
Good afternoon, members of this committee.
Mi nombre es Amanda Carrillo.
My name is Amanda Carrillo.
Y soy vendedora ambulante por los últimos 10 años porque me quedé desempleada.
And I'm a street vendor during the last 10 years because I was unemployed.
Estoy hablando en nombre de todos mis miembros, compañeros, vendedores.
I am talking in behalf of all my co-workers who are also vendors on the streets.
Y les pido a ustedes como miembros de este comité
and I humbly request your members of this committee
que dediquen fondos específicos para el programa de ventas.
That you can address funding, specific funding for the program of vending on the streets.
Necesitamos que ustedes
we need for you to
nos apoyen para que este programa funcione.
Support us so this program can function.
Necesitamos que inviertan para organizar y ser alcancen para educación, asistencia técnica.
We need you to invest for organization to be able to reach this goal, so we can have education, assistance for education.
Técnicas, no queremos que 6 millones para enforzarnos a vendedores es injusto. Educación.
We don't want 6 million. We don't want that only 6 million to reinforce vendors on the street. That it's unfair.
Y sentimos como una injusticia para la gente pobre. Gracias.
And we feel that it's an injustice for poor people. Thank you.
Gracias. Our next speaker is Claudia Moreno, followed by Faustino Martinez. Y es todo.
Buenas tardes, miembros de este comité.
Good afternoon, members of this committee.
Mi nombre es Claudia Moreno.
My name is Claudia Moreno.
Yo soy vendedora ambulante de Fashion District.
I am a street vendor on the Fashion District.
Estoy aquí haciéndoles un llamado para que apoyen a los vendedores ambulantes.
I'm here to make a call so you can support members of the, vendors on the streets.
Se nos ha hecho muy difícil sacar nuestros permisos por falta de recursos para nosotros.
It's been difficult for us to get permits because there's not enough funding for us.
La ciudad no nos está dando prioridad y en cambio nos está criminalizando y no podemos enforzar a los vendedores.
They're not giving us priority. We think that we are being criminalized and we cannot reinforce
A vendedores.
Vendors on the street.
Necesitamos dinero para que nos apoyen a nosotros.
We need money so you can support us.
Organizar y dar permisos a bajos recursos.
Organize and give permissions to a low income.
Para personas de la tercera edad.
And for seniors.
Invertir en programas que nos ayuden a empoderarnos.
Invest in programs that can help us empower us.
Más alcance para la ciudad.
More reach out for the city.
Para que trabajen con nosotros.
So they can work with us.
Nuestras necesidades de 350,000 son muy pocas.
Our needs of 350 are very, very small.
Para 6 millones que tienen para enforzar.
For 6 million that are for reinforcement.
Sentimos que es claro que no quieren apoyar al programa para que no funcione.
We feel that it's clear that you cannot, you don't want to support the funding, so it won't work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Señor Martínez.
Buenas tardes, señores concejales. Mi nombre es Faustino Martínez, vendedor móvil de Los Ángeles.
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Faustino González, member of the, disculpe, ¿de dónde es miembro?
Vendedor móvil de Los Ángeles.
Vendor Mobile of Los Angeles.
Mi petición para ustedes es muy clara.
My petition for you is very clear.
Nos hemos sentido ignorados por el concilio en nuestras necesidades.
We have felt ignored by the council in our needs.
Hemos pedido que inviertan en el programa de la venta ambulante.
We have asked to invest in the program for vending on the streets.
Pedimos un permiso de bajos ingresos, permisos de la tercera edad.
We ask for low-income funding as well as for seniors.
Y discapacitados.
And disabled.
Y una tarifa fija de $291.
And we want a fixed fee of $291.
$291 que sea fijo.
$291 fixed.
Cuando la ciudad invierta más dinero en esforzar,
when the city invests more in reinforcement,
nuestro trabajo está en riesgo.
Our work is at risk.
Sentimos que en el programa fracase.
We fear that the program can fail.
Necesitamos más fondos en educación y organizar.
We need more funding for education and organizing.
En entrenamiento.
And training.
Y más foros educativos.
And more educational forums.
Necesitamos que el Street LA
we need that Street LA
tenga más enfoque educativo y no abusivo.
Have more focus on education and not on abuse.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias. ¿Nadie más quiere hablar? Okay. All right. That concludes general public comment, and there being no other business before the committee, we are adjourned.
You too. Get a little